I still remember that night as if it happened yesterday. I had just returned from a short business trip, exhausted, but happy to finally be home. My suitcase was still by the door when I noticed something strange, a pair of shoes I didn't recognize, a scent of expensive perfume drifting from my bedroom. At first, I thought maybe Melissa, my daughter-in-law, had a guest staying over, but as I walked down the hall, I froze. Lying comfortably on my bed was Mrs. Grant Melissa's mother, wearing my robe, flipping through a magazine as if she owned the place. For a few seconds, I couldn't even breathe. That was my room. My husband and I built this house brick by brick before he passed away. Every corner carried a memory, the paint we chose together, the photos of Ethan growing up the blanket my mother made when I was pregnant. And yet here I was, standing like a stranger in my own home. I tried to stay calm. "Mrs. Grant," I said softly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is my bedroom." Before she could respond, Ethan stormed in. His tone was sharp, defensive, almost hostile. "Mum, Melissa told me you don't like having guests. If you don't like it, you can leave." Those words hit harder than any slap. I just stood there, numb, staring at the boy I once rocked to sleep, now looking at me like I was an inconvenience. All the nights I stayed up when he was sick, all the sacrifices after his father died, all the times I skipped meals to pay his tuition, they all flashed through my mind in a single second. And then I realized he truly meant it. There was no misunderstanding, no miscommunication. My son had chosen his wife's mother over me. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I quietly turned, walked out of the room, and closed the door behind me. The sound of that door clicking shut felt like the sound of my heart breaking. That night, I sat in my car outside the house for hours, just staring at the window of the room that used to be mine. The light was still on. I could see their silhouettes moving inside, laughing. People talk about betrayal in dramatic ways, loud fights, tears, screaming. But the real kind of betrayal is silent. It's when someone you love most looks you in the eye and says you're no longer welcome in the life you built for them. And that's when something inside me changed. I wasn't just a hurt mother anymore. I was a woman who had been erased, and I knew deep down I would have to fight to get my dignity back. When I first bought this house, it wasn't much to look at. The walls were cracked, the roof leaked every time it rained, and the backyard was just mud and weeds. But to me and Michael, my late husband, it was a dream, our first real home, a place where love could grow instead of just survive. We spent 3 years fixing it up with our own hands. Michael would come home from his construction job covered in dust and still pick up a hammer to repair the porch. I would paint the walls after work, one room at a time, singing along to old country songs on the radio. Ethan was only 6 back then. He'd run through the hallways laughing, leaving little handprints on the freshly painted walls. I never cleaned them off. They reminded me that family wasn't supposed to be perfect. It was supposed to be real. That's why this house means more to me than any document or title deed ever could. Every nail, every corner carries a story. The kitchen floor where Michael taught Ethan to ride his first toy bike. The garden we planted together one spring where he proposed again after 20 years of marriage. The living room where we danced slowly to music only we could hear. After Michael passed, the house became my anchor. I kept everything exactly how it was, his coffee mug on the counter, his flannel jacket hanging by the door, even his half-read newspaper on the table. It wasn't about holding on to the past. It was about keeping a piece of us alive. So when Ethan and Melissa moved in, I thought it would bring life back into this old place. I pictured laughter again in the kitchen. New footprints down the hallway. Maybe even a grandchild playing in the garden one day. I wanted this home to be theirs too, to keep love alive across generations. But somewhere along the way, it changed. The laughter became arguments behind closed doors. The smell of homemade soup turned into the faint scent of Melissa's candles. The walls that once echoed family stories now carried silence. It's strange how a house can feel so full and yet so empty at the same time. You can still hear the past whispering through it, the memories, the warmth, but it no longer feels like yours. Sometimes when I walk through the hallway at night, I still trace my fingers along the faded paint where Ethan's tiny hand once left a mark. It's my quiet reminder that love built this home, and even if they've forgotten it, I never will. Because a real home isn't made of wood and nails. It's made of effort, forgiveness, and the people who never stop showing up. When Melissa first came into Ethan's life, I truly believed she was a blessing. She was polite, smart, and always carried herself with confidence. She brought flowers on her first visit, called me Mum, and helped clear the dinner table without being asked. For a while I thought maybe, just maybe, my son had finally found someone who would love family as much as he did. At the beginning, everything felt peaceful. We shared Sunday breakfasts together, laughing over pancakes while Melissa showed me pictures from her childhood. She talked about her mother, Mrs. Grant, who raised her alone and worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. I respected that woman before I ever met her. I knew what it meant to sacrifice for your child. But things started shifting slowly, almost too quietly to notice. It began with little things. Melissa redecorating parts of the house without asking, moving furniture, replacing the family photos on the shelves with new picture frames that didn't include me. I told myself it was fine. Maybe she was just trying to make it feel more like home. Then came the constant phone calls. Every night I'd hear her whispering to her mother in the living room, their voices low but sharp. Whenever I walked in, they'd stop talking and change the subject. It was like stepping into a room right after someone says your name. You can't prove it, but you feel it. Soon after, Melissa started making decisions that used to be between me and Ethan. She convinced him to sell my old car, saying it was taking up space. She told him the house looked too old-fashioned, that they should modernize it. And little by little I noticed Ethan listening to her more than to me. There's a certain kind of pain that doesn't scream. It just settles in quietly like fog. It's when your child starts looking through you instead of at you. When you realize every suggestion you make is dismissed. Every word feels like an intrusion. The day Mrs. Grant moved in was the day everything truly changed. Melissa said her mother needed a place to recover for a few weeks. I didn't mind helping. I've always believed family should take care of each other. But weeks turned into months. And suddenly my kitchen smelled like Mrs. Grant's perfume. My towels disappeared from the bathroom, and my name was no longer part of any decision made under my own roof. I'd walk into the living room and find them laughing together while I sat in silence at the edge of the couch. They shared inside jokes I didn't understand, stories I was never part of. Every time I tried to speak, I felt like a guest in my own house. People assume losing control happens all at once, like a door slamming shut. But in reality, it happens little by little. One small compromise after another. Until one day you realize the home you built has become someone else's territory. I used to think love alone could hold a family together. But love without respect is fragile. It cracks quietly before it breaks completely. And by the time I realized that the distance between me and my son wasn't measured in words anymore, it was measured in silence. That night still lives in the back of my mind, like a bruise that never really fades. I had just come home from visiting a friend when I noticed my favorite chair was missing from the living room. In its place stood a brand new recliner, Mrs. Grant's apparently. Her shoes were by the fireplace, her blanket draped neatly over the couch, her teacup on my table. Every trace of me was slowly being replaced. I tried to stay calm. I asked Ethan if we could talk privately. He looked annoyed but followed me into the kitchen. The air between us felt heavy, like we both knew this conversation wouldn't end well. I said, "Ethan, I've tried to stay patient, but this isn't how I pictured our family living together. It feels like I don't belong in my own house anymore." He didn't even hesitate. "Mum, Melissa and I are trying to make this place feel like home for everyone. You're the only one making it hard." I blinked, trying to understand if I had heard him right. "Hard. Ethan, this is my home. Your father and I." He cut me off. "If you can't handle it, then maybe you should just go. Just go." Those two words hit harder than any argument, harder than any slap across the face. They carried the finality of a door slamming shut on decades of love sacrifice and memories. I stood there, frozen, my throat tight, my hands trembling slightly. The boy who once begged me not to leave him alone after a nightmare was now telling me to get out. I wanted to scream to remind him of every night I worked late, so he could go to college, of every time I defended him when people said he'd never make it. But I didn't, because I knew none of it would matter right then. He wasn't the same little boy. He was a man who'd lost his compass, blinded by someone else's influence. So I did the only thing I could do. I went to my room, packed a small suitcase, just a few clothes, my husband's photo, and the letters Ethan wrote me when he was a kid. My hands shook as I zipped the bag. The walls seemed to watch me, the house silent as if holding its breath. When I stepped outside, the night air hit me hard. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the porch light flickering through the fog. It was the same light that once guided Michael home from work every night. Now it was the light showing me the way out. I didn't cry at first. I just sat there, too numb to feel anything. But as the minutes passed, the tears came soft at first, then heavier. I wasn't crying because I lost a home. I was crying because I realized I had already lost my son long before he told me to leave. People think strength means fighting back, shouting, proving your point. But sometimes strength is quiet. It's the kind that stands up, walks away, and refuses to let pain turn into hatred. That night, my silence was my armor. It wasn't surrender, it was the calm before the storm. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of my story. It was just the moment I stopped waiting to be respected and started preparing to be heard. The morning after I left the house, I sat in my car outside a small cafe, staring at the steam rising from my untouched cup of coffee. My hands were steady now. The crying had stopped. The ache was still there, but it had changed shape. It wasn't weakness anymore, it was focus. I opened my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name. I hadn't dialed in years, Henry Davis. Henry was my late husband, Michael's closest friend, the kind of man who still sent Christmas cards, even after Michael passed. He was also a lawyer, sharp, honest, and fiercely loyal. When he answered, his voice was calm and familiar. I told him everything, every detail, every humiliation. How I was pushed out of my own home. How Melissa and her mother had slowly taken control, and how my son had told me to leave as if I were a stranger. He was quiet for a moment before saying, "Linda, you don't have to let this stand. You built that home. You have every legal right to take it back." For the first time in weeks, I felt something stir inside me, a quiet strength I thought I'd lost. I wasn't just a heartbroken mother anymore. I was the owner of that house. I had the papers. I had the proof. And now I had a plan. That same afternoon, Henry came by my place with a thick folder of documents. We sat at my kitchen table. the same table where I used to help Ethan with his homework and went through everything step by step. He drafted a 24-hour eviction notice for Ethan and Melissa. The words were cold and formal, but behind every line was the message they had forced me to deliver. This is my home. You crossed the line. As I signed the papers, my hand didn't shake. I didn't feel guilt anymore, only clarity. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming dignity, about teaching my son that love without respect turns into rot. Henry looked at me as I sealed the envelope. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked. I nodded. I gave them every chance to choose kindness. They chose control instead. Now I'm choosing peace. We mailed the notice that afternoon. As the post office door closed behind me, I took a deep breath. The air felt lighter, cleaner, like the first inhale after a storm. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't reacting. I was leading. That night, I didn't cry myself to sleep. I cooked a simple dinner, lit one of Michael's old candles, and sat by the window. The moonlight spilled across the floor, and I realized something important. Sometimes taking back your power doesn't look like anger or shouting. Sometimes it looks like paperwork, patience, and a clear mind. People often think starting over means walking away, but sometimes it means standing exactly where you've been pushed out and saying, "Not anymore." And that's what I did. Within 24 hours, Ethan and Melissa would receive the notice. Whether they stayed or left, one thing was certain: the next chapter wouldn't be written by them. It would be written by me. News travels fast in small towns. By the end of that week, half of Maplewood already knew that Ethan and Melissa had pushed me out of my own home. Some people whispered, others avoided eye contact, unsure of what to say. But a few didn't hesitate to step forward, and those few changed everything. Mrs. Martha, my neighbor of 20 years, was the first to knock on my door. She came holding a pie, the kind she always baked when words weren't enough. "You don't have to eat it," she said softly, "but you need to know we're all here for you." That single act of kindness cracked something open inside me. For the first time since everything fell apart, I didn't feel invisible. Then came Peter, the retired mailman who used to deliver our letters when Ethan was still a kid. He offered to help me collect evidence, saying he'd seen too much over the years to stay silent. He'd noticed strange deliveries to the house boxes and documents addressed not to me but to Mrs. Grant. His memory was sharp, his voice steady. It reminded me that truth has witnesses, even when you think no one's watching. And then there was Rose, one of my former students. She showed up one evening with her little boy and said, "You were the teacher who taught me to speak up. Now it's my turn to remind you to do the same." It was such a simple sentence, but it hit me hard. I had spent years teaching others to be brave, yet when life turned against me, I had forgotten how to stand up for myself. The more people came forward, the stronger I felt. Friends from church brought groceries. My old co-workers dropped by with words of encouragement. Even strangers from the local coffee shop stopped to say, "We're with you." It wasn't just sympathy, it was solidarity. People in that town had seen injustice before, and they weren't afraid to call it out. They reminded me that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who show up when the world turns its back on you. Each visit, each message, each warm handshake helped me breathe again. Hope crept back in, quiet but steady, like sunlight slipping through a crack in the blinds. I realized something powerful during those days. You don't rebuild your strength alone. You borrow a little courage from those who still believe in you until you can find your own again. The legal fight wasn't over yet, but I wasn't fighting from the shadows anymore. Behind me now stood a community, a group of ordinary people who refused to let cruelty win. And in that moment, I understood what justice really means. It's not just something decided in courtrooms or written on paper. Justice is when good people stand together and say, enough. I looked around at the faces that had gathered behind me: Martha with her pie, Peter with his notes, Rose with her son, and I knew I wasn't alone. Sometimes it takes losing everything to see who's still standing beside you. And in their eyes, I saw not pity, but pride. It started with a knock on my door one quiet afternoon. When I opened it, there stood Clara, my next-door neighbor, holding a manila folder against her chest. Her daughter Anna stood beside her, eyes wide and uneasy, like they were about to tell me something heavy. Linda, Clara said softly, "I think you need to see this." Inside that folder were printed screenshots, photos and copies of social media posts I never imagined existed, messages between Melissa and her mother, Mrs. Grant, posts where they bragged about finally taking control of the house, pictures of them hosting dinner parties in my living room while I was staying in a motel across town. Each page cut deeper than the last. There were text messages where Melissa told a friend she was tired of living under his mother's shadow, and that once the house was fully in her name, Ethan will finally see who really runs this family. I sat down, my hands trembling, as Anna quietly said, "Mom didn't want to show you at first, but people started talking. We thought you deserved to know." It was the proof I hadn't known I was waiting for, but it hurt more than I could have prepared for. Ethan wasn't cruel by nature. He was kind, gentle, and once had the biggest heart. But now, seeing these messages, I realized he hadn't turned against me out of hate. He'd been manipulated. Piece by piece, they had twisted his love, convincing him that independence meant rejecting me, that power meant control, that loyalty to his wife required betraying his mother. I had spent months blaming myself, wondering what I'd done wrong when the truth was sitting there all along, buried in a trail of messages and whispered plans. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed one photo that made my stomach drop. It was Ethan, smiling, standing next to Melissa and Mrs. Grant in front of a for sale sign. My house, the house Michael and I built, listed for sale without my consent. They had already started meeting with a realtor. That was my breaking point. The hurt turned to something sharper: clarity. I realized this wasn't just about family conflict anymore. This was about theft, manipulation, and betrayal at its deepest level. Clara reached out, resting her hand over mine. "You're not crazy, Linda. You were right all along. They planned this. And now everyone in town knows." For a moment I couldn't speak. My throat tightened. But I managed to whisper, "Thank you." When they left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the evidence spread out before me. It felt strange after months of confusion and guilt. The truth was finally clear, and yet it didn't bring peace. It brought resolve. I thought about all the times Ethan defended them, how he looked away when I tried to tell him something felt wrong. I thought about how easily trust can be weaponized when love blinds you. But here's the thing about truth. It doesn't care how long it's been hidden. It always finds a way to surface. That night, I gathered every document, every screenshot, every photo. I made copies and placed them neatly into a binder. For the first time, I wasn't reacting out of pain. I was preparing. Melissa and Mrs. Grant thought they'd buried me under their lies, but what they didn't realize was that every lie leaves a trail, and I had just found it. This wasn't just a revelation. It was the turning point. Because once you know the truth, silence is no longer an option. When I walked into the courthouse that morning, the air felt heavy, thick with the kind of silence that only comes before a storm. Melissa sat on one side of the table, dressed in her finest blazer, her lips curved into that familiar, smug smile. Mrs. Grant was beside her, whispering something that made them both chuckle under their breath. Across from them sat my attorney, Henry Davis, calm as ever, flipping through a folder of documents. He didn't need to speak. The quiet confidence in his eyes was enough to remind me that I wasn't alone. The hearing began with the opposing lawyer standing up, voice loud and self-assured. He presented a document neatly typed, stamped and signed, claiming I had transferred ownership of my home to Ethan and Melissa months ago. A gift deed, he called it. My stomach twisted. There it was, my supposed signature, right next to a date I remembered all too well. It was the same week Melissa had invited me to sign what she said were insurance updates. I should have read every line. I didn't. I trusted my family. I looked at that paper and felt the room spin for a second. Betrayal takes your breath away, twice, first when it happens and again when you realize it was planned. Melissa didn't look at me. She didn't have to. The small smirk on her face said everything. She thought she had won. Henry leaned toward me and whispered, "Don't react. Let them think they've got this." So I didn't flinch. I sat still, my hands clasped together, eyes fixed straight ahead. It wasn't weakness, it was control. Sometimes silence is louder than anger. The judge skimmed the papers, nodding as the opposing attorney spoke about intent and voluntary transfer. It all sounded rehearsed, polished, almost too perfect. That's when I caught Melissa glancing at me, her confidence flickering for just a moment. Because deep down, she knew something I did too. Paper lies don't hold forever. When the session ended, the judge didn't make a final ruling. Instead, he requested additional verification, giving both sides 1 week to submit further evidence. Melissa's lawyer looked pleased. Henry simply smiled. Outside the courthouse, she finally turned to me. Her tone was sharp, triumphant. "You can't fight what's already on paper, Linda." I met her gaze and said quietly, "If you want to play dirty, I'll teach you what it feels like to live in the mud." It wasn't anger that spoke. It was clarity. It was the voice of a woman who had been humiliated, underestimated, and pushed to her limit, but not broken. That night, I stayed up late in my kitchen, surrounded by boxes of documents, photo albums, receipts, anything that tied me to that home. Henry had asked me to look for any signature records, insurance forms, or utility statements from the past year. As I went through every drawer, I realized something powerful. I had spent years preserving memories in that house. But now those memories were my evidence. Every faded bill, every tax form, every signature could prove the truth. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't crying. I was planning. They thought they'd buried me under a mountain of lies. But they didn't know I'd learned how to dig. In the quiet of that night, I promised myself one thing: they might win a battle on paper, but I would win the war with truth. The storm was coming, and this time, I was the thunder. A few days after the court hearing, I asked Ethan to meet me. I didn't tell him why. We sat in the same cafe where we used to have breakfast every Sunday when he was little. Back then, he'd always order pancakes with extra syrup, and I'd pretend not to notice when he stole my strawberries. Now, across that same table, he couldn't even look me in the eye. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick, heavy, with everything left unsaid. Then quietly I placed a thick binder on the table and slid it toward him. Inside were the documents Clara and Anna had given me, printed messages, photos, screenshots. Proof of everything Melissa and her mother had done. At first he didn't move. Then he slowly opened it, flipping through the pages one by one. The color drained from his face. He read Melissa's words, her plans to get the house in her name, her complaints about me getting in the way. Every line was a knife twisting deeper. When he reached the photo, the one of them standing in front of the for sale sign, His hands began to shake. I stayed silent. I wanted him to see it for himself, to feel it, to understand what blind loyalty can cost. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes wet. His voice broke as he whispered, "Mom, I'm sorry." It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a few words, soft and trembling, but they carried more weight than any apology I had ever heard in my life. For months, I had imagined what I would say if this moment ever came. I had pictured shouting, demanding explanations, listing every wound he'd caused. But when I saw the pain in his face, the confusion, the guilt, I couldn't. Because deep down, I didn't want revenge. I wanted my son back. He covered his face with his hands and sobbed like the boy he once was. People around us turned to look, but I didn't care. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. The same hand that once guided his first steps was now holding him steady again. He kept saying it over and over, "I didn't know, Mum. I didn't see it. I thought she just wanted peace." I nodded slowly. "I know, Ethan. You wanted to believe the best in her. That's what good people do. But sometimes good people get used by those who see kindness as weakness." He cried harder. "What do I do now?" I took a deep breath. "You face it. You take responsibility. And you start rebuilding, not for me, but for yourself. The truth hurts, but it also sets you free." We sat there for what felt like hours, two people trying to piece together something that had been shattered. I knew nothing would erase what happened. Trust doesn't grow back overnight. But in that moment, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time: honesty in his eyes. When we finally left, Ethan asked if he could come home for dinner that night. I said yes, but I made one thing clear. If you come back, it's not to fix the past, it's to start again. He nodded, tears still glistening. "I understand." As I watched him walk to his car, I realized that forgiveness isn't a single moment, it's a choice you keep making every day. And that day, I chose to start again. Not because he deserved it, but because I was tired of letting anger live rent-free in my heart. Sometimes the truth breaks you before it heals you. But once it's out, once the lies crumble and love stands bare, you finally see things for what they are and who people really are. That day, my son didn't just apologize. He woke up. And for the first time in a long while, I believed we might still find our way back, not to the past, but towards something better. The house was quiet again, not the suffocating kind of silence that used to fill it when tension ruled the air, but a softer one, like the space finally had a chance to breathe. Melissa and her mother had packed their things and left 2 days earlier. No dramatic goodbye, no parting words, just the sound of the front door closing behind them. When I walked through the house afterward, it felt strange. The chaos was gone, but so was the noise that once made it feel alive. The scent of Melissa's candles had faded, replaced by the faint smell of lemon cleaner. The furniture was back where it used to be. My photos were on the shelves again. Everything looked the same as before, yet somehow completely different. Ethan stayed behind a little longer. He wanted to help clean up, maybe as a way of making things right. We worked side by side in silence, folding blankets, washing dishes, fixing things that had been broken. Every small action felt like an apology he didn't quite know how to say. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Mum, I think I need to leave for a while. I have to figure out who I am. Without her, without all of this." I nodded. I didn't try to stop him. There are times in life when love means letting go, not holding tighter. I told him you have to walk through your own storm before you find peace. But remember, the door will always be open. He hugged me before he left. It wasn't long, but it was real. The kind of hug that says, I see you now. Then he walked out into the cold morning, and I watched him go. I didn't cry this time. I'd cried enough for a lifetime. That night I sat by the window with a cup of tea, looking out at the garden Michael and I had once planted together. The moonlight touched the roses that had somehow survived through years of neglect. They were bent a little fragile, but still blooming. It struck me then this house wasn't just a place. It was a witness. It had seen laughter, heartbreak, betrayal, and healing, and though so much had changed, its foundation still stood strong. Just like me. I won't pretend it didn't hurt to lose my son's presence, to know the house felt emptier, without his voice echoing down the hall. But emptiness isn't always a punishment. Sometimes it's a kind of peace. For the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking up to anxiety or anger. The air felt lighter. My reflection in the window didn't look defeated anymore. It looked calm. People often think victory looks like celebration, but real victory, the kind that matters, is quiet. It's standing in your own home with your dignity intact, knowing you didn't let bitterness define you. I had lost pieces of what I loved, yes, but I had gained something far greater: clarity, boundaries, strength. And as I turned off the lights and walked upstairs, I whispered to myself, not in sadness, but in gratitude, you made it through. Because sometimes the greatest win isn't getting back what was taken from you. It's finding yourself again after losing everything. That night, the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. It was the silence of peace and the quiet sound of a woman who had finally come home. Months passed before Ethan reached out again. He called one evening and said he had been seeing a therapist named Dr. Rodriguez. His voice sounded steadier, calmer. He told me he was learning to take responsibility, to understand the choices that led him down the wrong path. I agreed to meet him, and he asked if I would join one of his therapy sessions. Part of me hesitated, old wounds still stung, but another part of me knew that healing never happens if we keep avoiding the truth. So I said yes. The day of the session, the three of us sat in Dr. Rodriguez's office. It was a quiet space filled with warm light and the faint smell of jasmine. Ethan looked nervous, shifting in his seat. Then unexpectedly the door opened and Melissa walked in. I froze. For a moment the air left my lungs, but Dr. Rodriguez gestured for me to stay calm, assuring me this was part of the process. Melissa sat across from me, her eyes, red hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence was unbearable until she finally spoke. Her voice was shaky, small. I was wrong, she said. I thought I was protecting myself, but really I was destroying something I wanted to belong to. She explained how her childhood had shaped her fears. Her father had abandoned her and her mother when she was young. Growing up, she learned that control was the only way to feel safe. When she married Ethan, she brought those fears into our home. Every time she saw the closeness between us, she didn't see love. She saw a threat. I listened quietly. For the first time, I saw not the manipulative woman who had taken everything from me, but a broken person who didn't know how to trust love without controlling it. Dr. Rodriguez asked how I felt hearing that. I took a long breath before answering. I understand her pain, I said softly. But understanding doesn't mean forgetting. Forgiveness takes time. Melissa nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, she whispered, and I'll wait for it even if it never comes. Ethan reached for my hand. Mum, I can't undo what I did, but I want to make things right. I want you both in my life, not out of guilt, but because I finally understand what family should be. It was the first time I'd seen true humility in his eyes since everything fell apart. It didn't erase the past, but it planted something new hope. Dr. Rodriguez smiled gently. Healing isn't about who's right or wrong, he said. It's about finding the courage to face your pain without letting it define you. That line stayed with me long after the session ended. Healing, I realized, isn't a single moment. It's a series of small choices to listen instead of accuse, to understand, instead of attack, to stay open even when you want to shut down. When the session was over, Melissa stood up, wiped her tears, and quietly said goodbye. I didn't stop her or reach out, not yet. But for the first time, I didn't feel bitterness watching her leave. I felt release. Later that night, I sat at home with a cup of tea and thought about everything Dr. Rodriguez had said. The past couldn't be rewritten, but maybe the future didn't have to carry its weight forever. Forgiveness. So I realized isn't about pretending the wound never existed. It's about choosing not to let it control you anymore. And as the night settled around me, I felt something new take root, not joy exactly, but peace. A quiet, steady peace that comes when you finally stop carrying what was never yours to hold. 6 months later, life looked different. The house was quiet, but not lonely. The garden was blooming again, wildflowers pushing through the soil like little reminders that healing doesn't happen overnight. It happens quietly, one season at a time. Every Sunday, Ethan and Melissa came over with their daughter Sophie. She'd run through the yard, chasing butterflies, while I watched from the porch, sipping tea. The laughter that filled the air wasn't the same as before, but it was something new, softer, more cautious, yet real. Ethan always offered to fix things around the house, leaky faucets, squeaky doors, anything he could do. I could tell he wasn't just repairing the house. He was repairing the bond he had broken. Melissa came too quieter now, humbler. She often brought home-baked cookies or helped in the garden, never forcing words, just showing effort. And slowly the air between us began to change. Forgiveness, I realized, doesn't arrive like a lightning strike. It's more like sunrise, gradual, steady, almost invisible, until you notice the world looks brighter than it did before. One afternoon, while watching Sophie chase a butterfly, Melissa turned to me and said, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but thank you for giving my daughter a family. I smiled. You're doing your part now. That's what matters. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. There were no dramatic hugs or tears, just quiet understanding. The kind that doesn't erase the past, but makes peace with it. Ethan hugged me before leaving that day and whispered, You were right, Mum. Love without respect falls apart. His words stayed with me long after they left. In the months that followed, I found myself reflecting often on what this journey had taught me. I learned that being a mother doesn't mean accepting pain in the name of love. It means setting boundaries so love can survive without breaking you. Real love, the kind that lasts, always comes with respect. Without it, love becomes obligation, a weight, not a gift. And forgiveness, it isn't surrender. It's freedom. It's the moment you choose peace over pride, understanding over anger. You don't forgive because they deserve it. You forgive because you deserve peace. That night, as I sat by the window, the house bathed in soft moonlight, I finally felt at home. Not because everyone had returned, but because I had. I had returned to myself, to the woman who had learned to love fiercely, but wisely. Before turning off the light, I whispered something I knew by heart. Now, better alone with dignity than surrounded by disrespect. Because dignity isn't about pride. It's about knowing your worth, even when others forget it. And if I could leave one message for anyone listening, it would be this. Protect your space. Guard your peace, not out of selfishness, but out of love, because the way you love yourself teaches others how to love you back.